Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn from beautiful, finally sunny and warm North Germany. And I'm joined today by a writer of a criminal mastermind, I suppose, because we have a really interesting perfectly 19th century fitting book today to talk about. But my guest today is Frank Garman. He is professor of history at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. He has published a couple of interesting articles on the American Revolution, but now has come to the wonderful side of the mid 19th and late 19th century with his new book, newish, I guess I should say. It's not quite a year old. A Wonderful Career in Crime. Charles Cowlam's Masquerades in the Civil War Era and Gilded Age from LSU Press. So first of all, Frank, thank you so much taking a little time during your spring break to chat with me today about your book.
Thank you, Niels. It's a pleasure to be here.
Always happy to have an interesting book to talk about too. So you kind of have the origin story a little bit in your preface of the book, but tell us a little about how you came to write a history of a 19th century con man.
Well, I started working on this almost by accident during the pandemic, and all of the archives were closed in the summer of 2020. And normally during the semester, I have a couple of students that work with me as research assistants, and they look through primary sources that I've taken pictures of at the archives over the summer. So since I didn't have anything to work on that fall, I asked my colleague, Jonathan White, who's a well-known Civil War historian, if he could recommend any collections that were digitized. And he said, look through the
Mhm,
pardon records sent to Abraham Lincoln. There are about
mhm,
1,100 cases there. Historians have only written about two or three of them. They all have a connection to the 16th president. They all have a compelling story of someone pleading for clemency or pleading for their life. He said, who knows? Maybe you could write a 4-page article with a student. And
It turned out a
that
little more than 4 pages.
definitely that's what got me started. My student found the letter from the pardon clerk summarizing Charles Cowlam's case.
Hmm,
It noted that he had a couple of things going in his favor, that he was only
mhm,
19 when he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for stealing from the post office, that he claimed that this was his first offense,
hmm,
and that he had some pretty sympathetic letters from prominent politicians in his home state of Michigan.
hmm,
But the letter also pointed out that he had a couple of things going against him. He had a letter from the penitentiary superintendent saying that he was lying about this being his first offense,
hmm,
that he'd been in the same prison before, uh, less than a year before, and that when he was apprehended the first time, that he was apprehended under an alias.
hmm,
And so the pardon clerk said, if any of this is true, Charles Callum has run a wonderful career in crime for one so young,
hmm.
and I can say without hesitation that his application is the least meritorious on file in the office.
That was a beautiful line actually in the book too. And like and was it like was this the first case the student found, or was this like after a little digging that they came across it? Like how did they kind of like why is this one, Like
So the way that they were digitized in chronological order. And
okay.
so this
This was
letter
one of the
was
first one, yeah.
yeah, it was dated April 12th, 1861. So one thing that caught the students' attention is, hey, this is dated the
Hmm.
same day as the attack on Fort Sumter. It's the very start of the Civil
Mm.
War. And so he thought that that was an interesting connection. He also
Mm.
thought the last line of this being the least meritorious
Mm.
application on file would make a good title for a
Hmm.
short paper, the least meritorious application. So I think that he found it pretty early on, given that they were
Yeah.
in chronological order, but he would have had to go through a month or month and a half or
Hmm.
so of cases that were sent to Lincoln or very early on in his presidency.
Right. So at what so did the students actually write a paper then?
Not yet. So
Okay.
we've written a draft of something together, but we
Hmm.
haven't published it yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So at which point did you kind of take this on as your project immediately or
At first, I saw it more as a side project.
okay.
But when I saw that he was pardoned by Lincoln after Virginia had
Mm,
seceded from the Union, then I thought that this could be a really interesting journal
mm,
article because it
right.
raised the question of what happened to federal inmates
Hmm.
after secession.
Right.
It put them in a really awkward position because they're separated from the
Mm,
evidence that could exonerate them. They're
mm,
appealing to the president of the United States, even though they're in the Confederacy.
mhm,
And so that spring, in the spring of 2021, I started looking for other cases, and I found a couple of examples where Lincoln had pardoned people after secession, or where Jefferson Davis had pardoned inmates convicted of federal crimes. But it's not until that spring that I discovered that Jefferson Davis had also pardoned him for the same crime that my colleague Jonathan White said this could be a book. And so,
oh.
so it's at that point that I began working on it full time.
Mm,
And so I spent the summer from the summer of 2021 through the spring of 2023 working on it full time
oh wow.
and sent
Yeah.
it to the press then.
Wow. So like one of the things that you can kind of sense in it is sort of a bit of frustration, right? Of like the record. And like how like I mean, we're talking about a conman with Cowlam, and he obviously has instances, right? Like this pardon application. He's lying about, oh, never did anything before, and why like and then of course it comes out he did. So how hard was it to track somebody down who wanted to partially hide his past?
It could be difficult. Part of the difficulty was that his name was misspelled all sorts of different ways.
Mm,
And it seems that he almost encouraged mispronunciations or misspellings of his name because he didn't want to be found.
yeah.
And he used several aliases.
Mm,
Uh, that added some challenges to the research as well. And it was difficult to verify if anything of what he said was true,
mm,
because typically in any letter that he sent, there'd usually be an element of truth there, but there'd usually be something very conspiratorial, over the top, dramatic, urgent, uh, some
mm,
emergency that he's describing, and it was hard to verify in some cases if it was true. So, one of the mysteries in the book that took me a long time to solve was whether or not he actually worked as a detective investigating the Lincoln assassination.
mm,
He told people for 20 years after the fact that he had been a detective investigating Lincoln's murder. And it took a lot of digging, but I found the receipt in the National Archives where he was reimbursed and he was paid as a detective for 17 days service. So it took a lot of digging to find that receipt, but in some cases
mm.
it was tough to verify some of his stories.
So how do you look for somebody that uses aliases? Like newspaper database or something. How do you find him then? Like,
Great question. Well, he would often use parts of his resume under
okay.
the alias. And so even though his name was Charles Cowlam, he would sometimes go by a different name, like Livingston Graham or William E. Burlick, and he would repeat some of the same stories,
Hmm.
or he would list some of the qualifications from his resume. That he would
Mm,
point out that he was the former commissioner of immigration for the state of Florida, that he had raised money for the victims of the Chicago sufferers from the
right.
Chicago fire. Um, so he would repeat some of his credentials in ways that I would sometimes search for the credential and then find
Mm,
him. In other cases, he was exposed.
Yeah.
as being Charles Cowlam,
Right.
and someone else had figured it out in the 19th century.
And you were like, thank you. You did a great job for me.
Yes.
You had detectives in the century working for you.
Yeah. Yeah. In a way, we do as historians.
Yeah. Yeah, you
Yeah.
could have had a research assistant. Like you never meet them, but they did their work for you. So, and so you like, did you have like kind of like how early on in the research process did you kind of develop like this is his resume and then we're able to like look for it and how I guess how late in the process were you still like finding like, oh, there's another piece to his resume that I didn't even think about, see, know about yet.
Well, there's an article that was published in the Detroit Free Press in 1874 that attempted to summarize his life. And
Okay.
that article was written by a New York attorney named Ira Schaefer, who was trying to track him down at that point in time because Charles had married half a dozen women in a span of 6 months in Manhattan and disappeared with their money. And he was representing one of the women that he had defrauded and was trying to locate him. So he told his story up to 1874 with a few errors that had to be double checked and verified, but it provided a good introduction to his life. So fairly early on, I had some structure, but there were also some big gaps, like what happened to him after 1874 when he disappeared, when he was accused of bigamy. So in terms of his early life, he was born in Michigan. He was arrested a couple of times early on. He started the Civil War in prison in Virginia for stealing from the post office, serving a 10-year sentence. And he received pardons from both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis during the Civil War. After the war, he worked as a detective investigating Lincoln's assassination. He had a brief stint in the Internal Revenue Service as a revenue detective, and he went to the United Kingdom where he worked as a detective there for the British government. So there was some structure from that 1874 article, but there were also quite a few things that were either missing or not clear. And even late in the project, I was still trying to figure out some of the details, or some of the moving parts of his story, like what was he doing in Canada for the Canadian government? That was a confusing part of the story.
Yeah,
Um,
see that.
why did the British government hire him?
Hmm.
There was some mystery there for a while.
Hmm.
What did he do after 1874, where he disappeared for 12 years? That was a difficult part of his story to piece together.
Yeah. And was there sometimes like you still have holes obviously in it that you weren't able to find. So what part of his life would you really love to get that Easter egg that like unravels that last bit that you would have liked to see?
Well, I'm sure that there are probably some sources from the late 1870s where he disappeared. Uh, he claimed to have gone to Guatemala to prospect for gold, and
Mm,
he claims that he befriended uh, the president of Guatemala at that point in time. Um, there are a couple of newspaper references that suggest that he did go to Guatemala under his assumed
mm,
name. And there are people who remember meeting him in
mm,
Latin America who record their
mm,
recollections in the newspaper in the 1880s after he was exposed under this particular alias. But I do wonder if there's anything more out there from his time in Central America.
yeah.
That would be really interesting to discover. Another missing piece is that I tried to track down descendants of
Oh.
his brother and
Mhm.
of one of his sisters. And one of the descendants that I corresponded with, her father was interested in genealogy, and she was kind enough to share his genealogical notes
Mm,
and correspondence with various relatives. And in the 1980s, he had corresponded with someone who knew Charles Cowlam's youngest sister, who died in the 1940s,
Mm,
and she had her photo album. And she was a professional photographer who worked for the Treasury Department as a photographer
mm,
for nearly 40 years. And I would love to know what happened to that photo album because
mm.
there could be all sorts of things in that
Yeah,
photo album, additional pictures of Charles, or
yeah,
maybe some notes that um, would give us some insight into what he did later.
yeah. Because you have and it's up in the actually in your corner, so that's trying to figure out where I need to point. It's your corners there. There will be the picture, the cover of your po book, but it's like you have the photo of a person there, and you say on the page where you actually use it, I think that it's a person fitting his description.
Yes, that photograph is in the University of South Carolina archives, and it was in a collection of photographs that were of his first wife's family. And that photo was found alongside her
Hmm.
photograph. It's unidentified, but it matches his description.
Hmm.
And so that's why we use that for the cover of the book. I believe that it is a photo of him,
Yeah,
but because it's not labeled,
yeah,
can't
prove
say
it.
with
Yeah.
100% certainty.
Yeah, but if it quacks like a duck, it might be a duck.
Yes.
So in this case, could
And
very well be.
I do have a photograph of one of his younger sisters that's also included in the book.
Mhm.
And you can see the resemblance in the face, in the
Mm.
nose and the ears,
Right.
that it looks like a clear relation there. And in terms of the way that he was described each of the times that he appeared in the
Mm.
newspaper, it matches his description very closely.
Wow. Hopefully, now that your book's out, more some people will come forward and be like, "Hey, I have something that might be of interest." That would be really nice.
I would love for that to occur. I have a friend who wrote about a different con artist, and later, after
Hmm.
publishing his research, had someone contact him where they found some additional papers from a later time period. And so it would be really cool to do a follow-up. And
Yeah, second
and
edition.
yes.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, that's amazing. Um, let me, yeah, we'll talk about his death later and sort of the uncertainty about that. So, I, one of the parts that I found really fascinating at the start of your book was sort of to think about how how do you do it? How do you become a con man during this period? And you really unraveled that really nicely in the book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that it would have been easier to disappear in the
Yeah.
19th century because people were so transient.
Hmm.
And because the Civil War brought so much upheaval, there were so many people moving around,
Yeah.
migrating to different parts of the country. And the way that they established connections
Hmm.
when they went to a new city is to tell a story of how they spent the war. And Charles Cowlam was very good at telling stories from the war. Not all of them were his own. I mean, he loved to tell a story about escaping from Libby prison with a broken leg in the middle of the night. He told a convincing story of warning uh, William Seward the night before President Lincoln's murder. Uh, he really drew people in with the stories that he
Hmm.
told, and they sounded convincing to the people who heard them.
Yeah. Which in part is sort of like your challenge, right? How do you separate fact from fiction?
Yes. Well, in the case of Livy Prison, he was never there, but he was in Castle Thunder, where he
Hmm.
probably heard in Richmond. So he probably heard from other inmates of prison escapes
Hmm.
taking place in the city. Now, the reason that I know that he didn't escape in the middle of the night with a broken leg is that his stay in Castle Thunder was short-lived. He was conscripted into the Confederate Army, and then he deserted. So it would have been very difficult for him to have walked all the way from Richmond to Norfolk, where he crossed the Union lines with a broken leg.
Well, but be before that, you also have that situation where he fakes the papers to go to Mobile to serve in, what was it, Quartermaster Corps?
Yes, after yeah, I should take a step back. So after he was pardoned by Jefferson Davis, and I should say he changes his story when he appeals to Jefferson Davis. When he presented his application to Lincoln, he presented himself as the youthful offender who was only
Mm,
19 when he committed his first offense. When he appealed to Jefferson Davis, he knew that his letters from Northern congressmen were not going to be as convincing.
mm,
And so when he appealed to Jefferson Davis, he presented himself as an ardent Southerner, that he enthusiastically wished to join the Confederate Army if only he could be released. And he produced a letter that was supposedly from his maternal aunt that
mm,
claimed that she had three sons who had already died or been wounded in the Confederate service. She said that one is buried in a soldier's grave at Shiloh, another in an unmarked grave on the banks of the Rappahannock, and a third that she described as a maimed and helpless creature who seemed to be driven insane by his what he had seen in his battlefield experiences. And her only regret was that she didn't have a fourth son to give for Southern independence, and she hoped that Charles Cowlam would fulfill that need. The only
mm,
problem with this story is that Charles Cowlam had no maternal aunt, that his parents were recent immigrants from England and Scotland, that they had no connection to the American South, they had closer ties to Canada, and he had no relatives fighting in the Confederacy. The only member of his family actually serving in the war was his younger brother George, who had enlisted in the Union Army.
mhm,
So after he was pardoned by Jefferson Davis, he was conscripted into the Confederate Army the
mhm,
first time, and he was assigned a position in the quartermaster's department in Richmond. Most likely, they assigned him there so that they could keep an eye on him,
mm, mm.
thinking that he could very easily desert and flee to the Union,
Which he
flee to the
eventually
North,
does.
which he eventually did. And during his time in the quartermaster's department, he reported after the war that he forged paperwork and transferred himself to Mobile, Alabama, and that he used that paperwork as almost a cover that he could travel freely through the South. That he made his way to Mobile, and rather than reporting for duty, he presented himself as a wartime speculator. And as he said after the war, he says, I spent the war years speculating in bacon, brandy, and whiskey. So he had a grand old time in Mobile until the Battle of Mobile Bay, at
Mhm.
which point he left the city, made his way back to Richmond, and was arrested on the outskirts of the city for pretending to be a Confederate captain and for stealing. And that's how he ended up in Castle Thunder.
Of course, you could ask now, it's like, is it real, right? Like, did he ever go to Mobile? Did he ever speculate there?
That one I had a difficult time with, but
I
there
bet.
are parts of his story where he has details in his narrative
Mm,
that someone who had been to Mobile would know about, like the location of
mm,
particular hotels
yeah.
or particular people who would have been in Mobile at that time. So his story to me sounded convincing that he had actually gone to Mobile.
Oh, wow. Good for him, I guess, that he for once didn't lie.
It also would have been a good place for someone presenting themselves as a wartime speculator to go because
Hmm.
Mobile was the last Confederate
Yeah,
port to be blockaded. So
yeah.
for anyone who's pretending to be a wartime speculator, and I say pretending because he had recently been released from prison, where would he have obtained the capital to actually become a speculator of any consequence? But he was telling people that he was a wartime speculator, and that would have been the place to do it.
Well, and he's also, because when you think of it, the other port would have been Wilmington. That's way too close to Virginia and Richmond, to the quartermaster folks that he's working with to kind of be found out too.
Yes, that's true.
So there's a little bit of distance for him to do that. And and you get to this really like I had to smile and shake my head every page when I got to chapter on the Lincoln assassination of like he literally fabricates a story that he knows secrets information about the Confederate plan, and they believed him. It's like that was the
Yeah.
part that got me the most. It's like these Union investigators trying to figure out who caused the death of Lincoln actually believed this guy.
Yeah, and here we have the convict who's now the detective. So
Yeah.
uh, he told a really convincing story. So after he learned of Lincoln's assassination, at this point he was had rejoined his family in Detroit after crossing the rejoined his family in Michigan after crossing the Union lines, and he boarded a train to Detroit, told a story to the colonel commanding the military district of Michigan that he had been in Richmond the whole time, which
Mm,
was mostly true.
yeah.
He said, I've been in that city since 1857, which was correct. That's when he was convicted and sent to the Virginia State Penitentiary.
He didn't have
Uh,
to say where he was residing during that time.
he told the detectives that he says, I was unemployed for a time, which was true. And but then he told them this grand tale of having infiltrated the Confederate Secret Service and having been a spy all along and having observed various goings-ons in and around Richmond
Mhm.
and various plots against Abraham Lincoln. So yes. He told a tall tale there, and they believed it, and
Yeah.
they hired him as a detective. His contributions to the investigation were pretty ancillary.
Mhm.
He visited a brothel at one point and reported to his supervisors uh, uh, his uh, interactions with some of the women that he met there and their Confederate sympathies.
Okay.
Yes.
It's almost like more detail than you needed to know, I guess. Makes you wonder what he did in that place.
Yes.
Um, wow. But it just struck me, right? Of like how 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 gullible these guys were. Because they just took a guy who they had no ability to verify whether he actually like had any like knowledge, whether he like was it was right that he was a spy, and they like, oh yeah, he can be a detective, even though he like you kind of elaborated about it on 2, 3 pages that he goes to the wrong person. He doesn't follow what he's supposed to do.
Yeah, and yet they hire him anyway. And they found his testimony so convincing that when they turned the case over to uh, uh, to the Provost Marshal General who
Hmm.
was supervising the investigation, uh, they included some uh, some ciphers and a note that Charles Cowlam could break those ciphers because he had seen similar ones in Richmond. And so they saw him as completely convincing.
I guess the question there kind of that follows from that is like, were they just so desperate to like have the stories they wanted to tell told kind of confirmed, right? That
Well, certainly investigative work in the 19th century was not as
much.
sophisticated as it was in the 20th. Um, Sometimes people would ask him how he knew certain things, and sometimes he would brag about it in some of his
Mhm.
letters. It seemed that one of his keys to success was his younger brother George, who was a
Mhm.
telegraph operator for the Union Army, and then after the war worked as a telegraph operator for Western Union and Franklin Telegraph and a few other telegraph companies during that period. And it seems that his brother George would sometimes help him get
Mhm.
access to information that he might not otherwise have access to. It seemed that he befriended telegraph operators in other cities, and that would be a key source for privileged information. So that's both how a con artist would operate to be able to
Mhm.
get some inside knowledge and how a shrewd detective would operate in that
Mhm.
time period. And so there's a lot of overlap between those two worlds.
Yeah, because I was just thinking exactly that, right? It's like, what's the difference between a con artist and a detective, or a criminal and somebody who's enforcing the law? I mean, it's sometimes a very slim margin of like, well, I was in prison. Well, now I'm hunting criminals, so I know how they're thinking.
Yeah, this came up during his time in the Internal Revenue Department
Hmm.
after the war. He worked in the district that covered Georgia and Florida, and he was based primarily in Savannah. He uncovered a whiskey smuggling ring that implicated a U.S. attorney and a U.S. marshal. Uh, he helped to exonerate an African American minister who was falsely accused of counterfeiting, but at the same time, his old habits uh, came back, and he also developed a habit for extortion and blackmail, of shaking down those that had violated the revenue laws and saying that if they paid him enough money that he could make the case go away.
That was just so sad on part, where it's like you kind of were like, wow, he actually did his job. He found some bad people. He uncovers this ring. He exonerates that pastor. And then it's like, but of course you had to do that again and get yourself in trouble.
Yeah, there's always a bit of shadiness in each of his dealings, and that it of all of the parts of his life story, it seemed like he was trying to go straight for once and trying to lead
Hmm.
a moral life, uh, but he wasn't able to stick to it.
Well, I guess maybe in his mind he was doing something positive, but yeah, no, it's obviously not the case there. Um, but yeah, it also kind of is an interesting transition, right? Because he has sort of this, oh God, I'm blanking on what he committed as crime in Ohio that he got into prison for, because he was in prison in West Virginia, Virginia eventually.
Yes, so this was when he was a teenager. It was before he was arrested for stealing from the post office. He was arrested for breaking into houses near Parkersburg, Virginia,
Wait, that's it. Second,
and
yeah.
he escaped across or I should say, he was apprehended in Ohio,
Hmm.
and he escaped from the jail in Athens, he and his accomplice. They were quickly recaptured and transported back to Virginia for trial. He was sentenced to 15 months in the state penitentiary, and this is why the Virginia penitentiary superintendent recognized him and described him as, quote, an old jailbird, saying that he had served in this prison before. And it also explains why, in his letter to the pardon clerk, the penitentiary superintendent pointed out that he'd been arrested under an
Hmm.
alias. And he says in his letter that he was recognized by men at the Ohio penitentiary at having served there previously,
Hmm.
which was not quite correct. He had not been sent to prison in Ohio, but he had spent time in the Athens, Ohio jail and had escaped from jail there. And that's why he would have been transported back to Virginia.
Right. So he has like, so he has he has sort of burglary in Ohio. He has theft from the post office. So it was like he had been stealing primarily. Then he becomes a detective, or like speculator. We can dismiss that. Like he becomes a detective, and he upgrades. Right. It's sort of a like upgrade. We're done with petty crime. We're going to go to the extortion level now.
Well, I say that he wasn't completely done with petty crime. He was arrested at least 5 times in the course of his life. So his first arrest was in his hometown for larceny. So again, theft. His second arrest is breaking into houses
Mhm.
near
Okay.
Parkersburg, West Virginia. Third arrest, stealing from the post office, first federal crime.
Right.
And fourth, picked up outside of Richmond for impersonating a Confederate captain
Hmm.
and for stealing. And then later, in the 1880s, again arrested in Ohio, this time for disorderly conduct. So Uh,
Oh,
so still not completely done with the petty crime later in life, but
yeah, but it seems like he's sort of building up to like higher and higher and bigger like crimes, sort of.
definitely, yeah. I mean, the stealing from the post office was a major crime.
Hmm.
Uh, and then yeah, later when he was committing serial bigamy in New York, that was a major crime as well. At the same time, when he was in New York, he was also running a fake secret society that he had started.
Yeah, we have
So,
to talk about that.
yeah, his frauds got larger as time went on.
Yeah, it seems like ooh, it worked last time on the small scale. Let's do it bigger and bigger and bigger and see how far you can push it almost. Like, almost like
Definitely.
a child, right? Of like, ooh, I got away with one cookie from the cookie jar. Let me see if I can now steal the ice cream from the fridge, and then I'm gonna get the entire chocolate bar next time.
His stories took on that quality too. So sometimes he would tell one version of the story and then later in life
Mm.
tell a more elaborate version.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you need to make yourself look good. It's part of the con.
Yes.
But we kind of got a little off track here because we kind of overlooked what I find, of course, very interesting because he encounters some guys in Chicago, overhears some stuff, and then tells the Canadians, "Oh, I heard these plots about the Fenians trying to invade Canada."
Yes, so shortly after the Civil War ended, there were a series of incidents that took place in Canada where a Irish nationalist group called the Fenian Brotherhood launched a couple of incursions into Canada. And their goal was to almost hold Canada hostage to
Mhm.
try to convince the British to release Ireland. And that was their big picture strategy. But in 1868, a prominent Canadian politician named Thomas D'Arcy McGee was assassinated in Ottawa. And in the aftermath of this assassination, the Canadian government was looking for Fenians who they believed had committed this murder. And so Charles Cowlam began sending letters to the Canadian Prime Minister, John Macdonald, indicating that he had overheard conversations at the Kalamazoo, Michigan train station
Mhm.
that he believed were some of the conspirators involved in that assassination. And the Canadian government found these letters so convincing that the head of the Canadian Intelligence Services, Sir Gilbert McMicken, went to Kalamazoo and met personally with Charles Callum for a couple of days, trying to discover what other information he had to determine whether or not they should hire him, and perhaps going to the train station to look for Fenians. But it seems that he ran the Canadian government on a wild goose chase because with each of his letters, in order to try to convince them to hire him, he pointed to more and more elaborate conspiracies, and
Yeah,
none of these conspiracies materialized.
yeah, it felt like he was almost like desperate for attention, right? Or like again, sort of as a child, right? Like you don't respond the first time they're jumping on you, then they jump on your face. And it's like they just he seemed like desperate to come back. I want to talk to you.
Yes, in one of his letters to Sir Gilbert McMicken, the head of the Canadian Intelligence Services during that period, he says, I have not heard from you since our last meeting, but I have heard of you because I have seen people watching you. And, sort of suggests that nothing that he sends through the mail is safe
Mm,
and that his correspondence and his person are being watched and that the Fenians are after him in some way. So yeah, he really spins an elaborate tale over these
yeah.
series of letters.
Well, I felt that really got to the heart of sort of your larger piece of thinking in terms of like like if the Canadians actually had checked this guy out, right? Checked his credentials a little bit more, or even the US with regard to the investigation of Lincoln's assassination had checked this guy out more, it would have been like, yeah, never mind. But because you didn't, you don't have that capability yet. You fall for the.
Yeah, there were no background checks in the 19th century. People people were evaluated based on the stories that they told and the connections that they had. And another factor that led to his success is that Callum was very good at befriending prominent people and
Mhm.
carrying with him letters of recommendation from those individuals. So he could pull out of his pocket and say, here's a letter from a Michigan congressman. Here's a letter from uh, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, I think third Assistant Secretary of the Treasury when he worked in the
Mhm.
Internal Revenue Service.
Right. Yeah, and it does make you wonder though how easy it is also to forge those letters, right? You know.
As far as I can determine, they were not forged. There were a couple of cases where I looked to see if they were, and I tried to find handwriting from those individuals to think, because in some cases the letter would be glowing, positive,
Yeah.
with so much praise for him that it made me wonder whether or not he had forged it. And in each of the times that I looked, that was not the case, but it did cause some concern.
Wow. It like we talked before the interview started about like people asking you about making comparisons to Trump, and it just naturally came to my mind like that doctor's letter, right? That Trump got that says he's in perfect health. And
Oh
everyone
yeah.
is like, yeah, he probably wrote that himself.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. But on the other hand, it's sometimes this like how often have we encountered this in our personal lives that this person that we found the most despicable that is a backstabber but has like two or three people wrapped around their fingers who loves them, who thinks they're the greatest person in the world. And with that, you get kind of the privileges of letters of recommendation, reference, introduction.
Yes. When Callum tried to obtain a job with the British government, uh, the Michigan congressman who had written letters of recommendation on his behalf when he was soliciting the pardon from Abraham Lincoln also wrote letters on his behalf to the British government. And they presented a fantastic picture of his life. The Michigan Congressman Francis W. Kellogg says at one point in one of the letters that he was the head of the Secret Service within the Confederacy, that he had infiltrated it so much that he was like a super spy in the South. So he had clearly believed Cowlam's stories and had even added to them.
Mm-hmm. Right. And he was also the guy that wrote him a letter for his pardon, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was a freshman congressman representing his home district of Battle Creek, Michigan. He had befriended the Cowlam family and really enthusiastically uh, tried to secure this pardon from him during the secession crisis. He wrote letters to Lincoln's attorney general uh, and to the pardon clerk, pleading for clemency and emphasizing in one of his letters, he said, Virginia will secede any day. Act now or never.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't take action now, he could be trapped in the South.
Yeah. Well, I guess the rest of the family was nice, so.
Yes, yeah, everyone else in his family was respectable, well respected in Michigan, and not in any way related to his crimes or or schemes.
Well, like, did Kellogg was his name, right? Like, did Kellogg ever met him then? Like, were you able to figure out if they met in person at any point in time where Kellogg could have been like, yeah, this guy is shady?
I'm sure that they met at some point because they maintained
Okay.
a correspondence,
Okay.
because he was writing letters of recommendation for him in
Right.
1860 and 61, and he then continued to write letters on his
Mm,
behalf as late as 1871. And
Mm,
so that's a 10-year period where they would have maintained a correspondence. So
mm,
I'm sure that they met in person. I don't know where or when,
mm.
but at some point in that 10-year period, I suspect that they met.
Yeah, I mean, it made sense that. And yeah, we already we talked about the British. So Florida, like the
Yes.
Sunshine State, was a very big, and that story was rough because it was so many pieces, so many like moving parts, so like it was just complicated of like the I guess crime he was about to design or like the conspiracy was trying to manufacture to get himself elected.
Yeah, so Callum, when he went to the United Kingdom, he went there after he left the Internal Revenue Service,
Mm,
and he got a job with the British government almost as a spy slash detective in Ireland.
mm,
And he claimed that he was investigating the same Irish nationalist networks, the Fenians. The British government fired him after about 6 months because he was egregiously overbilling them, and they
mm,
accused him of doing no real detective work. At which point he returned to the United States and decided to go back to his old district that where he had served in the Internal Revenue Service. He went to Florida and he befriended a Reconstruction Republican governor named Harrison Reed. And the
mhm,
two of them concocted a scheme to try to interfere in the 1872
mm,
election in Florida. Reed realized that he had no chances of being reelected as a
mhm,
Republican. And so some friends of his convinced him that he should throw his weight towards the Democrats, and that if the Democrats won the state elections, they would send Reed to the US Senate, because in
mm,
those days, US senators were elected by the state legislatures. So Reed hatched this plan, and Callum helped him out with it in a couple of ways. He first tried to remove some of the federal oversight over the election,
mm,
and he convinced Ulysses S. Grant to remove the U.S. Marshal and U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Florida,
mm.
who Reed believed had conspired in his latest impeachment proceedings. He was a
It was a
very
couple of
con
peach.
he was a very controversial governor of Florida. He faced impeachment proceedings against him at least 3 times during his 1 year term. And he believed that these two men were responsible behind the scenes for encouraging the legislature to impeach him the latest time.
I
So he
guess I should
convinced,
ask you briefly, like, how do you get impeached 3 times in one?
great question. Well, he was impeached. Uh, he had two Senate trials. Um, the third time I think was I'd have to check my notes, but I think the third time was not successful, but they
Hmm.
did try to impeach him. But he was impeached twice, and in the two Senate trials, in the first one he was convicted,
Hmm.
but it was overturned. It was vacated by the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court had been entirely appointed by Harrison Reed because he was the first governor during Reconstruction. So they sided with him and they threw out this conviction. In the second case, they impeached him, but the Senate adjourned before the trial could be concluded. And so he appealed to the state Supreme Court and said, well, their adjournment is a dismissal. And the Supreme Court agreed with him, and he announced himself governor of Florida. So it was a very contentious period of Florida history, and uh, really, really crazy era of Reconstruction politics. So Reed convinced President Grant to remove the U.S. Marshal and the U.S. Attorney, and he convinced Grant to appoint Charles Cowlam as U.S. Marshal for the Northern District of Florida. In this case, Cowlam went to Washington. He met briefly with President Grant and convinced him that he was the best man for the job. Uh, Grant was something of a maverick politician. He did not want to use the old patronage networks of just trusting senators to recommend people
Mhm.
for federal office. And so he instead believed that if he met with someone personally, he could have a real sense of their character. But
Mhm.
this was also Grant's fatal flaw. It made him really susceptible to con artists like Cowlam. So after a brief meeting, Cowlam convinced him to appoint him U.S. Marshal, where he returned to Florida and an outcry ensued. It seemed as though every Republican in Florida wrote to Washington saying that Cowlam is a fraud, a crook, perhaps not a Republican, that he'd rendered no service to Reconstruction, and Grant rescinded the appointment after 10 days, at which point Cowlam decided to create something of a fusion ticket. He decided to print deceptive looking ballots that had Grant and Wilson, the Republican presidential and vice presidential candidates, with all of the state office holders for the
Mhm.
Democrats. And he included his own name running for one of Florida's two congressional seats.
I think you have a picture of it in the book too.
Yes. Yeah, there's one that survived that's in the Florida State Library.
How
But
hard was that finding? Like you, we were looking for one ballot that one man produced, of which, what was it? Like he got 75 votes or something.
he received 92 votes across the state, so he did not win in his
But
effort.
one of those survived.
Yes.
What's the chance of that?
Well, I should say the Florida State Library is really well run, and they were extremely helpful in researching the book in terms of photocopying, digitizing, and sharing sources with me. So they were really all stars in terms of facilitating research in Florida history. So I really want to commend them. Um,
Still, like just that somebody keeps that ballot for 160 years. It's
yeah.
incredible.
So in the weeks before the election, Reed and Cowlam realized that the governor had extraordinary authority. That the Constitution of Florida at that time said that the governor could remove any state official and appoint any county officer. So they realized that they could remove county election inspectors and county supervisors and move polling places in key counties. So in the weeks before the election, Cowlam and Reed worked together to try to steal it. Now, they were ultimately unsuccessful. The Republicans won handily both in the national and in the state elections. Reed did not go to the U.S. Senate. Cowlam was not elected to Congress. Their plan failed, but they tried.
Yeah, but it's incredible, right? Like two convinced guys who are like, I want to win this election, are able to pull all of this off, right? Because when you think of it, it's like you're I didn't count how many people they removed, how many polling places they moved. It's like it's a huge amount of logistics involved in this. And no one said, wait a minute, or this is weird. What's going on? Right? Like it's incredible what they did.
There was some pushback against it, and people did write to Republicans in the state government, criticizing what was going on and
Mm,
trying to convince them to take action. In some cases, there was one case where Reed removed one county official,
mm.
and then replaced him with somebody else, and then replaced the original, or like it was a complicated back and forth because of some of the pushback that he received. But it is amazing the lengths that they went through to try to manipulate the results in this election.
And in like, I guess it wouldn't have been a crime.
I'm sure that it would be, but I don't know. I'm not an attorney, so I don't know.
Well, I mean, I guess they never got charged with anything. So
No, no, they weren't.
I get, but this would like, I mean, when you think of all the things he has done, this would be his biggest crime, right? That trying to steal an election.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Um, Yeah, not in terms of dollar amount, but in terms of the scandal, definitely.
Well, the size of it, right? I mean, you could have
Yeah.
become a like representative potentially for 4 years. I mean, 2 years for sure, and then you're an incumbent and use a
Yes.
machine to keep that job for another term. Uh, Jeez,
Yes.
could you imagine that? Like, never mind, never mind. Let's not imagine the conman being congressman. Uh, wow. But yeah, it just that was just and how elaborate that scheme was. That they kept all of these pieces moving. That they were able to convince Grant about it. But then I was really impressed how quickly the Republican machine was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And how quickly they were able to get to say like, Grant, no, this needs to you need to change this again.
Yeah, it's interesting. We usually look at patronage politics as being corrupt and inefficient, but
Mm,
here patronage networks responded really quickly in
yeah.
exposing this scheme. And parts of it were not fully exposed until this
Mm,
book, because one of the letters that I uncovered describing the conspiracy lays out each of the parties and how Reed is going to appoint particular county supervisors. And it's a letter written by Cowlam. It's in the College of William and Mary Special Collections Library. And the letter ends by saying, Reed will appoint every man that Bloxham supports. And Bloxham is the Democratic
yeah.
candidate for governor that year. And so it shows the length of the conspiracy that here is a sitting Republican governor
Mhm.
taking marching orders from the Democratic candidate running that year of what he's going to do to manipulate these results.
Incredible. I mean, that's just incredible to think about what. And Colin did that under his own name, right?
Yes,
So it's like
not
that was
under
the
an
easy
alias.
fight, I suppose.
Yes.
So from here it's sort of downhill from now because now, well, he disappears for a little bit.
Well,
No,
first,
no, sorry, he
first he went to,
reappears in New York.
yes. So after losing the election in Florida, he decided to go to New York City. And there he started a fake secret society that he called the Order of the Patrons of Industry. He modeled it off of the Granger movement. The Grangers were a group of farmers who organized and believed that if they united together that they would be able to exert greater political influence.
Mm,
And Cowlam realized that there wasn't a similar organization for urban working men,
mm,
that they couldn't join the Granger movement because they weren't farmers, but they sympathized with it.
mm,
And so he felt like there was a hole in the market there. So he created a fake secret society by day, and then by night, he presented himself as an eligible bachelor, even though he had married in 1866 in Detroit. And this is by now 1872 and 73 and early 74. He presented himself as an eligible bachelor and in a span of 6 months married half a dozen women in Manhattan and disappeared with their money. One of the women hired Ira Schaefer, the pugnacious New York attorney, to try to track him down. And he took out advertisements that included statements like, this woman has lost $50,000 and is prepared to spend another 50,000 getting even with him.
it was Matt.
Yes.
But that's kind of completes that story. He's never found, right? Like Ira never finds him.
No, I did not find him. So he disappeared. He fled New York. He changed his name and for the next 12 years went by the name Colonel Livingston Graham.
Yeah, we'll get to him in a little
Yes.
bit. But it's just in this again, it speaks to your book's general theme of like you wouldn't be able to pull that off in Ohio or in Indiana or Michigan, but in a massive urban space like New York, where it's so anonymous, you could pull that off.
He realized that New York City in those days did not have marriage licenses, that all marriages were privately recorded in places of worship.
Right.
And he realized that if he moved from neighborhood to neighborhood, presenting himself as a youthful bachelor, he was always described as having a youthful appearance.
Yeah.
That he told people that he was rich. He said that he
Mm,
would marry no woman who could not match his own fortune. And he targeted wealthier widows.
hmm Yeah. Like, desperate for attention. He found his victims well. Um,
Yes.
but back to because he runs that husbandry organization out of his newspaper office. And what I really found fascinating was that Philadelphia guy or Philadelphia chapter that is like, what's going on? Let's investigate this guy.
Yeah, he started this fake secret society and convinced a couple dozen chapters to organize and
Mm,
to pay monthly dues to the national chapter. But he would typically receive their initiation fees and then send them a letter shaking them down for more money, saying that he needed money for uniforms and supplies and etc. So a Philadelphia chapter of working men thought this was a ripoff, and they sent one of their members to New York to try
mm,
to speak with the editor of this publication. And they could not find Charles Cowlam. They instead met a guy who called himself William E. Burlick and told them that the editor was out of town and couldn't be located. Uh, and
just missed him.
sent,
I think
gave,
was one of them too.
gave this guy the runaround. So they sent a New York reporter from the New York Daily Graphic who investigated the newspaper and discovered that this secret society thing was all a swindle.
Hmm. So you think the guy that like because you had him like what he was in the office that the guy from Philadelphia was in the office for like an hour and then he left and then he was back for a little while. So you think it was Cowland that he actually was
It was
talking with?
it was Cowlam the whole time because at one point in the conversation, the New York Daily Graphic reports the whole story.
Hmm.
He says something that gives it away that William E. Burlick is Charles Cowlam. He
Hmm.
mentions at one point that he has walked every square mile of Georgia and Florida, and no one knows that territory better than
Hmm.
him. And that was the same
Okay.
district that Charles Cowlam had
Right.
worked in the Internal Revenue Service, and he had just come from Florida.
Right. Yeah, no. And but it's when you think of it, it's the audacity too, right? Of like I'm just gonna assume in the moment a fake name because any person, I guess, that walks through the door, I'm gonna assume is mad at me and I'm gonna fake it.
Yes. Yeah, he was running this fake secret society newspaper scheme out of an office building that was struggling to attain tenants. And from the description, it sounds like this was the only occupied office of this floor, that all of the other doors were for rent. And he's got to figure that anybody who's spending the effort to track him down is not pleased.
Yeah, yeah, no, no kidding, right?
It's,
That like I guess like, considering the women, the chapters he is taking money from, like there's a lot of people that don't like him. Whew. And so how do we know how many women he actually married? Did you track down like the marriage registers from these churches or
so this
sort of
was this was one of the most difficult parts to research because none of the women were identified by name in the newspaper.
right, so you mentioned that.
Yeah, so either because they didn't want to be named out of shame or embarrassment, or because of newspaper conventions at that time that didn't always
Mm,
report women's names in the
right.
newspaper. But none of them were identified. And
Mm,
so I tried searching for marriage records uh, under Charles Cowlam's name because when he was exposed for being a serial bigamist, they used his name, which suggests that he was not using an alias in marrying each of these women. And
That
so
is kind of stupid.
I didn't locate any marriage records
Hmm.
uh, from any of the potential sources during this period. But part of the difficulty is that there's simply so many marriage records from New York City
Right.
during this time period.
Yeah.
In the 6 month span, it's in the tens of thousands. And so I did as thorough search as I possibly could,
Right.
but wasn't able to find any of these women's names. So, in terms of the number, one newspaper source suggests half a dozen in a span of six
Hmm.
months. There could be more.
Just crossed my mind. Did he ever appear in the census?
Yes, he appeared in the census in 1850 when he would have been 12 years old,
Okay, well,
and
kid.
in 1870, shortly
Okay.
before he left for the UK. He was living with his
Okay.
brother George in Washington, D.C. But
Wow.
those are the only two times that he appears in the census. He wasn't in 1860. I guess
He's in prison.
they didn't record inmates, I guess, in the Virginia Penitentiary that year. And then in the 1880 census, he was living under the name Livingston Graham and
Right.
does not appear anywhere.
Right. Which takes us to Livingston Graham
Yes.
because he like that again. Like there were so many questions that opened up, and it was so fascinating because he like I was taken back to Adam Dombey's book of like these guys in the Confederacy in North Carolina who fake, oh, I'm a Unionist, oh, I'm a Confederate, oh, I'm both, oh, whatever do I need to be to get money. And he felt exactly like those guys that just swindle their way into pensions and, like in this case, a veterans home spot.
Yes. Yeah, he was a career opportunist and grifter. He interestingly didn't apply for a pension, and I wondered about
On
that for
what?
for a while because that would have been the most lucrative thing that he could have
Yeah.
obtained in pretending to be a Union veteran during this time. But the reason that he didn't
Hmm.
apply for a pension in the 1870s or 1880s is at that point in time he would have needed to prove a wartime injury, and it would
Hmm.
have been difficult to fabricate proof that he
Hmm.
was injured during
Yeah,
the
and they
Civil
were,
War in fighting
I,
for the Union when he hadn't fought for the Union.
yeah, it was very hard. The U.S. Veteran Services were extremely diligent about that kind of stuff, more so than maybe you
It would
should have tried in Virginia to get a Confederate one.
it would have been easier later in the
Yeah.
1890s or in the early 20th century because it would have been harder for anyone to verify his stories.
Hmm.
But in the 1870s and
There's too
1880s,
many
obtaining a
veterans.
pension would have been quite difficult. So instead, as you pointed out, he tried to check into a soldier's home in 1886, pretending to be a Union colonel, claiming that he suffered from dementia. The newspapers described him as appearing to be about 40 years of age. He would have been 48 and suffering from dementia and having the initials CC tattooed on his forearm. He claimed that he had been a colonel for the Union Army for 4 years, but couldn't remember where he had fought or who he had fought with.
But he
And
remembered that CC stood for Charles Cowlam,
yes,
which
that
is kind of
later
like,
come out as a result of the investigation.
and then they investigate, and that's the fun part, right? They're like searching. Let's see if this story, the bits and pieces that he seems to remember, check out.
Yes, the War Department investigated his claim for 3 months. And after a 3 month investigation, which according to them took them from Canada to Guatemala, discovered that his real name was Charles Cowlam and that he had never been a soldier in the Union Army and therefore had no claims to the soldier home.
But it was just fascinating of how all these different places that they were like, okay, so we got this request to investigate. Oh, he says he worked for the Secret Service, so let's send it over there. And they're like, nope, goes to another. And it just again, just like when the was Lincoln administration, how serious he is taken in this. Like,
Yes. Well, they were very thorough,
Yeah,
and investigating each of the different agencies. Well, maybe he was in the quartermaster's department. Maybe he was a spy. Maybe he was a civilian working for the army. They investigated all of the possible routes before discovering that
yeah.
his real name was Charles Cowlam.
I guess in part you're kind of like, was he too ambitious in this scheme that he got found out?
Well, I think that it worked out for him for a time
Yeah,
because
that's true.
temporarily he was able to stay in the soldiers' home
Yeah.
uh, on a temporary basis. So at this point, by 1886, he had been on the run for 12 years. He had presumably
Mm,
spent through all of the money he'd stolen in New York.
right.
And it seemed by this point in time that he was destitute. And
Mm,
one of the reasons why he applied to the soldiers' home rather than a pension is that to get into the soldiers' home in those days, one only needed to establish that they had served in the Union Army and that they couldn't take care of themselves anymore.
right.
So being homeless and having dementia would satisfy that.
Yeah, yeah. And like, of course, then it gets found out that you didn't serve.
Yes, yes.
That was a little kink in this his plan there. Um, but I do because so if I understood the way it was you presented it correctly, they eventually asked the family to pick him up because they actually believe he is dement, but they have figured out he's a nobody. He's just trying to play the role. So I kind of like, this sort of moment that you wish you had, this moment where his brother picks him up, and it's like, was he demand? Was he not demand? Like you go
Well,
home and it's like, oh yeah, I'm totally fine. I just played this. Like the conversation that happened in that moment, you would love to see.
I don't believe that he had dementia. Both I'm not a physician, but I it seems unusual for someone who's 48 to be suffering from dementia. And then
Yeah.
also the stories that he told the detectives in the War Department were the same stories that he'd been telling about his wartime
Hmm.
experiences for the past 20 years.
Yeah.
And
They were
for
rehearsed.
so it didn't show any diminished capacity there. He has still had the same capacity for storytelling. And so when his brother picked him up and returned with him to where he was currently living at the time, Madison, Indiana, the trace goes cold. It's not clear what happened to him after 1886. And this is
Hmm.
perhaps the greatest mystery and why there might be a sequel at some point if I discover what happened to him after 1886. But he simply disappeared. He never
Yeah.
showed up in any of the city directories in Madison, Indiana. His
Hmm.
first wife, Mary Ives Cowlam, who lived the rest of her life in Detroit, she began recording herself in the city directory as the widow of Charles after
Hmm.
1892. So she may have received some news of his death. At that point in time, remember, he was 48 in the soldiers' home. So by 1892, he'd be about 6 years older. He
That's
was
still
described
young.
he was described as a heavy smoker. His brother George only lived to be 56, so he may have died. He gave everyone the indication that he didn't have long for this world, and some people described him as suffering from perhaps of a respiratory ailment, perhaps owing to his years in prison.
I was
Uh,
just gonna say, like, I mean, prisons at that time were pretty horrific places to be in, and he spent a number of years in prisons early in his life that could have had an impact on various parts of his body.
But he may have changed his name. He may have continued the same schemes under an alias. If he did a really good job of it
Yeah.
because I have tried searching for other misspellings of his name. Some of his aliases were based on misspellings.
Mm,
I have tried every possible spelling of Charles Cowlam. I have looked for any other sources where people are telling the same sorts of stories, like escaping from Libby prison with a broken leg, of meeting John Brown, the
mm,
abolitionist, of any of his other tall tales of
mm,
working as a detective for the
mhm.
Lincoln assassination and etc. And if he did adopt a new alias, he made a clean break because he didn't tell the same stories again after 1886. So I think that he may have died sometime thereafter.
Yeah, but you also have at the end there's a story of him coming from San Francisco to, was it Annapolis or somebody with
In New
something of a similar
Jersey.
name, going to New Jersey and then getting married, and so like, but it's like we don't know.
Yeah, there are lots of stories in the newspaper that are tough to verify. So there's a Charles Cowlane, which was an alias that he had used in New York. A Charles Cowlane that's mentioned in a newspaper article in the 1890s of a couple that goes from San Francisco, a place where Charles Cowlam had spent time, goes all the way on a transcontinental train journey to New Jersey, of all places, to get married in the last municipality in the country that does not require marriage licenses. They get married and then return the next day, like leaving on the same train back to San Francisco. It's such a suspicious looking story. Why would someone travel across the country to the last place that did not require marriage licenses only to return the next day? It looks shockingly suspicious. But with
And
that
it fits
short
the
new
MO.
with that short newspaper snippet, there's not enough information to confirm anything.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. Um, so wrapping up here slowly. So when we look at, it's obviously a fascinating life, but when we look at it, what does it what does it most to you say about sort of the Civil War reconstruction and Gilded Age period? What is it that readers should really get from this, that like says this is a story of this period?
Well, it tells us a lot about verifying information during this
Mm,
period. The way that people uh, could verify someone's story or credentials tells us a lot about the upheaval of the war.
mm,
And it tells us about the ways that people could change identities
mm,
almost during this period, how
yeah,
fluid they were during that period, where someone
mm,
could move between aliases, move between cities, and change the way that they presented themselves overnight. So uh, it's a very American story to be able to adopt
yeah.
so many identities.
Well, you usually like, it's like the Western movie. You think of that as a Western thing, but it's he is doing it in this in the most American urbanized spaces, New York and Ohio and Florida and like the East Coast, like some densely populated spaces.
Yes, for him, the bigger the city, the better, and
Yeah.
the more turnover and turbulence, the better.
Mm,
One of the reasons why he was so successful for a time in Florida is that Florida was becoming a tourist destination, and the population of Jacksonville and Tallahassee during that period exploded with summertime visitors
mm,
and with Northerners
yeah.
participating in Reconstruction. So part of the reason he was so successful is that there were so many people like him in Florida
Mm,
at that same point in time, people who had come from the north to the south after the war
yeah.
and blended in.
Still, that was just such a fascinating story. Like I hope a lot of people get your book and kind of make it part of a lecture because it's just so beautiful material to lecture, right? I always when I thought about in the past when I taught US history and I was like, oh, what stories, what kind of material can you use for lectures? Those books like that were always the ones that I always gravitated to because they give you the ability to talk about these different places through the lens of a person and this where students are just they get fascinated by that stuff.
Well, thank you. Yes. Yeah, it was a really fun book to write, and it's a really fascinating, almost an adventure story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's sort of and the bits and pieces. It's sort of the detective stories that you're putting yourself into as well as sort of the writer. Like we can't know and we don't know. We he disappears. All like um the way it's worded in passages. It's really nice. So final one. What was your favorite part of Colin's life to find or research or
I would say that some of the descriptions about him are
okay.
really hilarious. So people will sometimes write a letter to somebody else, and either they believe his story or they don't believe it, or they're skeptical. And some of those little anecdotes are so funny. Like there's a letter from a U.S. senator from Florida who writes to the secretary of the Republican National Committee, and he writes to him and says, yeah, there's this guy named Charles Cowlam here, and he says he works for the Secret Service, and that's all well and good. Uh, but he says he's meddling in our state politics here, and I wonder why you sent him. And if you ask me, I think that he's more of a fool than a detective. So it's interesting in that short letter that he accepts without any skepticism that he works for the Secret Service and that
Yeah.
he's been sent from Washington for some purpose. He questions why he was sent and then skeptically says, he's not much of a detective. I think he's more of a fool.
Yeah, he was
So,
on it. He was yeah, yeah. I guess once you it got harder and harder to kind of see through his lies, but also easier and easier at times because he had created so many webs of lies to get
yeah,
stuck
it's
in.
it's difficult for someone who tells a lot of things that are not true to keep their stories right. And so
Hmm.
one of the tactics that he adopted is you keep telling the same stories
Right.
with slight variations of them. And that was one thing that made it easier to track him down because he liked to
Hmm.
tell particular stories to everyone that he met.
Yeah. Well, it was fascinating. So, but at this stage, I think we have really covered your book in great detail. But there's so much more detail in it that we haven't had a chance to look at and talk about. So it is definitely worth getting a copy of it, I would say, and reading this fascinating crime story. So it's just for reference here, if you want to get it. It's A Wonderful Career in Crime, Charles Cowlam's Masquerades in the Civil War Era and Gilded Age from LSU Press. Um, so thank you so much for taking the time here away from your spring break, Frank, to talk about this incredible figure you found and your student found.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.